Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. America and Europe after the Great Recession. Now the reason I'm doing this video is because we're hearing a lot from this guy here, Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, that America should be more like Europe in terms of its healthcare policy, education policy, benefits for workers, employees, and in other ways, prescription drugs, and paying for basically everything. But the truth is, it isn't all good in Europe. Now, it isn't all bad, but you have to look at Europe and America and compare the two using certain types of indicators. Now, what I've done is I've decided to look at three indicators that show the economic condition of the nations. So, unemployment, economic growth, and debt to GDP ratios in terms of how much money the government owes relative to how large the economy is. So these are three indicators, and I'm going to compare America and Western European countries to see, in fact, which ones are better. So if we look at America, we see that the United States' unemployment rate since the Great Recession ended 10 years ago was between 3.6 and 10%. Economic growth in terms of GDP per year has been around 2%. And debt to GDP ratio as of last year is at 106.1%, which is the highest that we've ever had in peacetime. Only in wartime have we seen higher debt to GDP ratios. One website that I think is a very good site that shows you a lot of economic data is this site called Trading Economics, which you can look at economic statistics not just from the U.S. but also from European countries. So the U.S. unemployment rate is shown according to these bars here going back to 2018, but really it goes back decades. And what this website does is it publishes information from the research and statistical databases of the countries that it is looking up. So for the unemployment rate, they've gone to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics to show, in fact, what the unemployment rate is. And GDP growth rate, the same thing. It shows data going back many years, not just 2016, but far into the past beyond that. And it goes to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis where GDP growth numbers are found. And then it, in terms of federal debt to GDP ratio, 106%. It went to the U.S. Bureau of Public Debt in order to get that information. So I think this website, Trading Economics, is a great site if you want to look at economic data for any specific country that you are trying to get information from. It does this for Europe also. So Europe, let's look at some European countries like the United Kingdom. In the green, I have statistics that are actually better than the United States. So unemployment rate since the Great Recession ended 10 years ago in the UK has been between 3.9 and 8.5%. That's better than the United States, which is why I have it in green. Unfortunately, economic growth has been around 0% per year. This is a common theme that you're going to see throughout this video among Western European countries that I will show you, is that they don't grow economically. They are stagnant, 0%. Debt to GDP ratio in the UK is better. It's not good, but it is better at 84.7% as of last year. And once again, Trading Economics can allow you to see what their statistics are just by typing in the UK and unemployment rates, and they show you. They go to the Office for National Statistics, which will give you information on their unemployment rate. And it also gives you their GDP growth rate in the United Kingdom. And they show you what their debt to GDP ratio is by going to the Office for Budget and Responsibility in the UK, which holds those numbers. Now, here's where, and I'm not going to show you every single bar graph, but basically all this information that I'm showing you I've gotten from this website, which gets the information from those very countries and their databases that provide the information. So Denmark has had a better unemployment rate than the United States, 3.8% to 6.2% since the Great Recession ended. Again, economic growth around 0%. Debt to GDP ratio, actually pretty good at only 34.1%. Switzerland, again, doing better than the United States in unemployment, very low actually, between 2.1 and 4.4%. The United States has not actually seen an unemployment rate in the 2 percentile since the 1950s. So this is one place where Switzerland is way ahead of the U.S. Debt to GDP ratio, very good at 27.7%. But once again, economic growth at 0. This country does not grow economically like pretty much every Western European country, just about. Norway, the same thing. It does better than the U.S. in unemployment. It does better at debt to GDP ratio. But economic growth, a little bit better, 1%, but still not as good as the U.S. at around 2%. 1% is better than nothing, but still lagging behind the United States. Germany, doing better than America at unemployment and debt to GDP ratio, as you can see there. Economic growth around 1%, which, again, less than America, but better than other countries in Western Europe. The Netherlands, unemployment and debt to GDP ratios are better than the United States, but no economic growth. Luxembourg, same situation, although their economic growth rate is better at 1% a year, still less than the United States. Iceland, same situation, 1% economic growth, but here's the unemployment rate between 1.6 and 9.1%. The U.S. has not seen an unemployment rate in the 1 percentile since the 1940s. Debt to GDP ratio, 37.7%. Ireland, a country that actually does worse than the U.S. in unemployment. And I'm actually listing the countries from best to worst in a sense, because now you're going to start seeing European countries that do far worse than even the ones that we've seen so far. Unemployment has been higher in Ireland than the U.S. Economic growth actually matching the United States is at around 2% per year. I have it in blue because it's not better than the U.S., but it is not worse. It is matching. It's the only European country in Western Europe that matches the U.S. in economic growth. And its debt to GDP ratio, not as good as a few other countries, but at 64.8%, not bad and far better than the U.S. Now we get to countries that are actually not doing as well. Unemployment in Finland has been higher than the U.S. at 5.5 to 11.9%. 11.9% is the unemployment rate that the U.S. has not seen since the Great Depression. Economic growth at 0%. Debt to GDP ratios at 58.9%. European countries actually are not spending as much money in terms of taxpayer dollars as the United States relative to the size of their economies, which is why they do better generally than the United States. But there are some exceptions, as you will soon see. France, a terrible unemployment rate, and it's been this way for a long time, between 20 and 26% since the Great Recession. Economic growth at 0%. Debt to GDP ratio, almost the same as the U.S., a little less at 98.4%. But these numbers are pretty consistent over the last several decades for not just France, but all of these European countries. Spain, 14 to 27% unemployment rate over the past 10 years. Economic growth at 0%. Debt to GDP ratio close to the U.S. at 97.1%. Belgium, 5.5 to 8.8 unemployment rate, which is not that much worse than the U.S., but it is worse if you average up the low rate to the high rate. You do an average of the lowest unemployment rate and the highest unemployment rate during this time, you see that it's actually slightly worse than the U.S. Again, economic growth rate, 0%. Debt to GDP ratio, very close to the U.S. at 102% as of last year. Sweden, another country that does worse than the U.S. in the unemployment rate and an economic growth at 0%, but its debt to GDP ratio is pretty low at 38.8% as of last year. Now we're starting to see countries that are doing terribly. Portugal is worse than the U.S. in every single one of these categories. A higher unemployment rate, a far lower economic growth rate, and a debt to GDP ratio of 121.5%. Worse than the U.S. in all three categories. This is also the same for Italy. Worse than the U.S. in all three categories. Higher unemployment, lower economic growth, really no economic growth at all. In fact, I think Italy had a recession between the end of the Great Recession and today, and a debt to GDP ratio of 132.2%. The worst country is Greece. Unemployment between 9 and 28%, no economic growth whatsoever, and a debt to GDP ratio of 181.1%. It is the most indebted country in Europe according to the debt to GDP category. Far worse than the U.S. and indicative of what their situation is, spending way too much money on public benefits. Well, here's where the U.S. is today. Our debt to GDP ratio has climbed over 100% in peacetime for the first time in history, and it's going to get worse. But the United States, we have to remember, is not better and not worse than Europe when it comes to every category. You have to look at different categories. Bernie Sanders thinks that Europe is just so much better than the U.S. Well, there are a few countries that do better in the unemployment category and in the debt to GDP ratio, but economic growth for the most part is worse than the United States in almost every European country, except for Ireland. It's the only country that matches the U.S., but it doesn't match the U.S. in other categories. So, if we want to be like Europe, then we really want an economy that is stagnant. And the European economies are stagnant largely because they have way too much government intervention. Way too much in terms of the benefits that companies are forced to provide workers, such as paid leave, which costs money, such as strong unions, which are very hard when it comes to regulating whether or not you can hire and fire workers, and ultimately a system that discourages new businesses from starting up because of high costs. I do not want to be like Europe in that sense, because it does not provide an environment for the standard of living to rise. The United States, still as bad as it is becoming, is still ahead of Europe when it comes to economic growth. Unemployment, on the other hand, there's a difference in certain countries because the U.S. actually has minimum wage laws. Some countries in Europe, like Sweden, do not have minimum wage laws, which help produce a lower unemployment rate. And they don't spend as much money publicly because of fewer obligations, such as not wanting to rule the world and not having other things that they pay for that the U.S. pays for. So Europe is not the worst place to be, but it is not the best place to be either when compared to the United States. And I just want people to know, if you want to know how good something is, you have to look at multiple indicators, not just one. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel Libertarian Black Man. Follow us on Twitter at Libertarian Black Man, and we hope to see you in the next video.